Securing representation by a literary agent is an enormous challenge for an author seeking to be traditionally published. How do you get their attention? How do you formally submit a query request? You'll need a query letter, a logline, a summary, and a synopsis. In this video, I'll explain why each of those are important, how I wrote my own, and I'll share some insight on customizing applications to stand out. But first of all, how do I feel as I'm going through this process? The way I'd like to describe it is brazen, but self-aware. I'm confident in all the hard work I've done, both in writing and preparing my applications. I need to focus on what I can control, and most of all treat this as a learning experience, which is why I'm sharing it with all of you. I've submitted 11 queries so far and heard back from 2 agents. Unfortunately, both responses were form rejection letters, so I didn't get any direct feedback on what worked or didn't work for my application. Coincidentally, both agents who declined were named Laura, and out of the 11 on my initial list, there's another Laura. I'll let you know if I pull off a hat trick. I also set up a separate author email address, and I noticed I'm getting anxiety every time I see that there's a new message. If any of you are also going through the querying process, what are some tools that have helped you feel better about the process? And quickly, before we get into the rest of the episode, something about me. I cut my own hair. I started doing it in the pandemic, and because I'm cheap, I never stopped. I guess this isn't technically something about me, but Tammy eats with her paws. It then creates an incredible mess that I have to deal with. Those of you who watched my second video might remember I mentioned a spider in my shower, Shelob. She unfortunately passed away, but I want to thank her for her companionship since March. Your web snared more than insects. It captured my heart. Last video, I reviewed tools to help you find a literary agent, but how do you select them? What are the qualifications that are right for you? Obviously, that's incredibly personal. I can't answer that question. You have to decide some of that for yourself, but I'll share some of the considerations I made in making my selections, and hopefully that can help you too. The following is an agent's MSLW, manuscript wish list. I really like the passion of this agent's introductory paragraph. It made me feel like they weren't just about bottom line and dollars, that they actually genuinely care about this field and want to promote good works. This entry in particular stuck out to me. I haven't read the unspoken name, but the rest sounds exactly what I was trying to achieve with my manuscript. This is another entry that caught my eye. Lit RPG is inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, taking a more literal translation into the fantasy genre. In my book, D&D is more the framework that justifies the fantasy. The fantasy is played real as if it's happening to actual characters, but in our world, the cast is playing a game of Dungeons & Dragons. This agent's interest in that genre makes it feel like she could be a good fit for what I'm trying to achieve. Here's another example of an agent that caught my attention. I feel like sharing these names isn't a breach of privacy since they're public figures doing business. So my first impression here, this is someone who loves science fiction and fantasy. That's a good sign for me. But more specifically, they like D&D. Again, natural keyword fit for me. Taking a look at her MSWL, all of this is also encouraging. Part of the aspiration I had in telling my story was contributing more intersectionality to fantasy. Viewpoints that didn't receive much traditional attention in the genre. And for my final example, yet another agent who seems to love fantasy. I want to connect to an agent who's savvy in the business side of things, but I also want them to be passionate about the genre I love. And once again, in Gabrielle's case, not only does she play D&D, but she's run campaigns at conventions. That's a great sign for me. This entry is applicable to my manuscript, so I thought that was an encouraging sign as well. My novel has a 2-world structure. One is fantasy and one is reality, but it's not a portal that the protagonist can travel through. It's 2 separate worlds. I did just notice this, and I touched on it the last video. My word count's a little on the high end. It's not for epic fantasy, but in the scheme of books at large, it is, and agents are potentially a bit wary to embrace that. Hopefully Gabrielle will give me a chance and actually consider reading my manuscript. So now that I've found some agents that appeal to me, what do I do next? Tabby. Every agent will specify exactly how they'd like you to submit, so you have to be careful to follow those instructions. You'll always need a query letter, and I've gone into great detail in another video about how to write that. But what's a logline? What's a summary? What's a synopsis? A logline is essentially an elevator pitch, your novel described in a single sentence. If you feel like you could just improvise one on the spot, I challenge you to come up with one for Lord of the Rings. I'll share the actual one later. Many books, especially the fantasy doorstoppers that I prefer, have very complicated themes and plots. So for Game of Thrones, how would you describe that in a sentence? The official logline for Game of Thrones is 9 noble families fight for control over the lands of Westeros, while an ancient enemy returns after being dormant for millennia. I think that example shows how difficult this process can be. That was a perfectly adequate logline, but I wouldn't say it's that gripping. Now, how about Lord of the Rings? Did any of you come up with a logline? If you did, please share them below. The official one reads, "A young hobbit inherits a ring that can destroy the world and must journey across Middle-earth to destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom." And again, it's like, yeah, that is what it's about, but there's so much more to the story. I guess the key is engaging the audience's attention enough that they give it a chance. So since I was so willing to criticize other loglines, it's only fair that I share my own. Mine reads, "The distinction between the rich world that players construct in a tabletop game and their real lives unravels, causing fantasy and reality to collide." Hopefully you're all now on the edge of your seats, trembling in anticipation. Once you have a logline, you next need a summary. Courtney Mom describes that as a rundown of your book's major characters and themes, and the writing of one will force you to acknowledge the places where your manuscript needs work. That's great advice. She continues, if you can summarize, in 3 sentences or less, what the main themes, conundrums, and character arcs are, stop reading this and get to finishing that book. It's going to be great. In my case, I treated it more as what might be on the back of the novel. I think that's another way you can approach a summary. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but here it is if you'd like to take a look. Last up, some agents request a synopsis, which is an extremely detailed explanation of what your book is about, what happens in it, where the characters go, every juicy detail. I'm not going to share mine because I hope you read my book someday. Once again, you can run into some issues if your plot is extremely complicated, you have too many characters, things of that nature, and I struggled with that myself. I think the key is to identify the major arcs, the important moments, and make sure you include those. An agent can always reach back out and ask for a more detailed explanation later. I don't think you should send them a 20-page synopsis. It should be as brief as possible. Mine ended up being about 2.5 pages, but given the scope of my story, I think that was appropriate. Agents may also request a bio, where you probably want to focus on writing and publication-related history, but if you don't have that, like me, get a little more creative. The second to last request I've seen is your potential audience, and I think that's a wonderful thing to consider as you're writing. Who is this book for? Is it something cozy that people can read by a fireplace or on a vacation? Or is it a tense and nail-biting thriller? The last request I've come across is similar books. Comps. Don't be like me and only have dated comps. Try to find something recent, something that's shaken up the market. To close out the episode, I want to go into greater detail about something I flashed on the screen last video. This Reddit post by a best-selling author. I think Chad gives some incredible advice. Customize your query letter for each agent, stressing the feature of a book they've said they most enjoy or are most interested in acquiring. If one agent says they're looking for upmarket, call it upmarket. If they say they're looking for literary, call it literary. I ran into this with my query letter because I decided to label mine as dark fantasy, which is actually not very applicable. I misinterpreted that as a more serious and consequential tone, but it's much more about the horror genre. So I may have already discouraged potential agents by labeling it dark fantasy. I'm better off with epic fantasy, fantasy, or taking Chad's advice, seeing what they prefer, and labeling it that kind of fantasy. Chad follows up that banger paragraph with another one that's great. If they don't specify what they're looking for, be as vague as possible so you don't pigeonhole yourself in a way that discourages them. This statement also had a strong impact on me. You're trying to get an agent. It's their job to help package your novel in a way that is commercially viable. But if you never get that agent, you never even get that opportunity. I'm not saying lie and mislead people, but you need to get your foot in the door somehow. So if you finesse it a bit, I think that's appropriate, especially when you're initially trying to attract an agent. The user Chad was replying to was suddenly concerned about the consequences of doing such a thing. Chad quickly tried to reassure that poster. You're not going to jail for being a little misleading about your genre. That said, don't abuse people's trust. Publication is a small industry, so you need to protect your reputation. Be savvy, not ruthless. And there you have it. I hope that gave you some insight into the process. Now that we have all the pieces we need to submit, how does that actually go down? How do you stay organized? And how do you personalize your message for each agent? Find out next time.